Okay then, brethren, today I want to look at a peculiar passage in the first letter of Peter, a rather puzzling passage. Uh, People have different ideas as to what it might mean. Very few have any idea what it's in the scriptures for. So we'll try and do two things: understand what the passage means, understand why the Apostle Peter gave us this particular illustration. So let's start by looking at the passage, which we'll find in the first letter of Peter, or the first book of Peter, whichever you prefer. And we're in chapter 3. We're going to read verses 18 through 20. So first Peter chapter 3, verses 18 through 20, and then we'll sort of unpack it. It says, "For Christ also suffered once for sins, the just for the unjust, that he might bring us to God, being put to death in the flesh, but made alive by or in the Spirit, by which also he went," and here it comes, "by which also he, Jesus, went and preached to the spirits in prison, who formerly were disobedient, when once the divine long-suffering, or God of patience, waited in the days of Noah, while the ark was being prepared, in which a few, that is 8 souls, were saved through water." So that stumps a lot of people, right? Because, hang on a second, so the Lord Jesus went and preached to spirits in prison? Who are the spirits in prison? And it says, what's this about when the ark was being prepared back in the days of Noah? What's that got to do with anything? So that's the passage we're going to look at, to try and understand what the passage means, and probably more importantly in some ways, understand why the Apostle Peter chose such a peculiar passage. What's Peter getting at? So the questions really, I guess, are, who are the spirits in prison? When did Jesus preach to them? Why did Jesus speak to them? And is there any relevance for you and me today? Right? Now, there are, as you'd expect, this is the Bible, there are different views as to what everything means, including, of course, this passage. I guess a very popular understanding is that these are dead people in hell, some sort of hell, right? So the dead people, the souls of people who died some time back. And so Jesus has gone to speak to the souls in hell. I think many Catholics see in this passage an allusion, not an illusion, but an allusion to purgatory. Right? If you're a Catholic, and perhaps some other Orthodox doctrine or denominations might have the same view as a Catholic, you believe in purgatory. So people who are Christians, especially Catholic ones, of course, which is the only ones they recognize probably, if they die and they're not perfect, and not many Catholics would be perfect, even by Catholic theology, then they don't go to heaven because they're not fit. So they go to purgatory. And in purgatory, they are purified over eons and eons of time. And when they're finally purified, they are allowed to go up to heaven, right? So they see this as, well, this is it. Here we have Jesus, not quite sure why, but visiting the disembodied souls in purgatory. That's a sort of understanding that they have. And they sort of tie that into 1 Peter 4 and verse 6. Just read this one. I'm taking it slightly out of context, but this is how they take it. So 1 Peter 4 and verse 6, "For this reason the gospel was preached also to those who are dead." Right? So Jesus has gone into purgatory or hell somewhere, and he's preaching to the dead, to these spirits in prison, right? That's sort of one of the key understandings of this passage. And you might ask, when did Jesus preach to these spirits in prison? And again, a common answer is that, well, yeah, Jesus preached in the 3 days he was in the grave. So Jesus was crucified, and he was in the grave for 3 days and 3 nights, or major view by most churches it is 1 day and 2 nights, right? Good Friday to Easter Sunday just doesn't work. But anyway, in that period, whatever it was, 3 days, 3 nights, one day, 2 nights. When Jesus was there, he went and preached to the spirits in prison, right? And that's based upon the fact that, as far as the majority view is concerned, when Jesus was dead for 3 days and 3 nights, he wasn't. Because, well, Jesus' body was dead, and his body was placed in the grave for 3 days and 3 nights, but obviously Jesus himself can't die because he's God. And Jesus is part of the Blessed Trinity. You can't have Jesus dying, otherwise the Trinity ceases to exist. You want to get 2 then, right? God the Father and God the Holy Ghost. Jesus is dead, so that can't be possible. So most Orthodox churchgoers believe that although Jesus' body was in the grave, Jesus himself, the conscious Jesus, was somewhere else for that period of time. And, this is it. In that period, Jesus went into this place and preached to the spirits in prison, right? That's part of what they believe, or at least what some believe. Understandably, it's a bit of a confusing picture, so the views differ by denomination, but overall that's sort of what many believe. You can see, again, an allusion to it, I think, in the old Apostles' Creed. I don't know what your background is, but when I was growing up, we had to memorize the Apostles' Creed as I was a Catholic at the time. And in the Apostles' Creed, which is a sort of core prayer that goes back, 1,500 years-ish, maybe a bit more, right? And you would sort of learn the tenets of the Apostles' Creed, which are deemed to be core fundamentals. And it talks in the Apostles' Creed about how Jesus, suffered under Pilate. He was crucified, died, and was buried. He descended into hell. And that's generally taken to be Jesus, the conscious being, went into hell, and where, of course, he met the spirits in prison, etc., right? Because most Orthodox standard churches around us believe that Jesus was fully conscious when he was dead, because it was his body was dead, not his immortal soul, spirit, whatever, right? So Jesus went and preached in hell, possibly, or in purgatory, possibly, to the saints who were there from olden times. We've got a picture we can show you, which is an illustration. This is goes back a long way. This is taken from the mural of a church in Florence. Back in the 14th century, this was painted. We've actually been to the church itself, although I don't remember seeing that. But it was a big church. There's lots and lots of works of art in it. But on the left, you've got the typical artist's impression of what Jesus allegedly looked like. Underneath Jesus is a black shriveled up figure, which I think is supposed to be the devil. And in the centerpiece, you've got all the saints from olden times, probably Old Testament saints, I think. So this is Jesus, whilst he was dead, sort of turning up in this prison, this hell-type place, and he's preaching to the saints of old who are there. All right, so that's been a standard understanding of what happened in this passage, going back, centuries and centuries, right? It's not, of course, the only view. So the view there is the when. When did Jesus preach to the spirits in prison? Well, in the 3 days that he was sort of in or not in the grave, right? That's when it took place. They say, right? It's not what I believe, right? Another view, another popular view is that, like it says here, verse 19, by which he went and preached to the spirits in prison who formerly were disobedient when once the divine long-suffering waited in the days of Noah. Oh, well, that's when Jesus preached to these people, right? He preached to these people who are now dead today, but he preached to them back in the days of Noah, whilst the ark was preparing, right? That's what it says there. He preached when once the divine long-suffering, the God of patience, waited in the days of Noah. But of course, they realize, these people who teach that, believe that there's no evidence anywhere of Jesus himself actually preaching to the people in the pre-flood days. So what they tend to say is, well, it was Noah who did the preaching. Noah was a preacher of righteousness, and it was the Spirit of Jesus Christ in Noah, and the Spirit of Christ in Noah inspired Noah to preach. So it sort of was Jesus preaching to the people back in the days of Noah, but obviously through the physical presence of Noah himself, right? So, I mean, it's like, doesn't make a lot of sense to me. I don't think either of those views holds any real water, right? And yet, the Apostle Peter, writing to the brethren, chose to use this story here of Jesus preaching to the spirits in prison to illustrate. It's, as far as Peter's concerned, this is a great illustration of a key truth. But what key truth? What's Peter trying to get at? What's he trying to convey to us? The answer is, well, the beginning of the answer is in 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 17. This is the key principle that as a theme almost that goes through the first letter of Peter. Verse 17, for it is better, if it is the will of God, to suffer for doing good than for doing evil. Right? That actually is probably the key summary of the letter. 1 Peter. Verse 17, it is better, if it is the will of God, to suffer for doing good than to suffer for doing evil. For Christ also suffered for us, etc., etc. Spirits in prison, right, verses. And the word for in verse 18 means because. It is better to suffer for doing good than to suffer for doing evil because Jesus went to the spirits in prison and preached to them. So how does that illustrate why it's better to suffer for doing good? In what way is it better to suffer for doing good? How does the spirits in prison passage throw any light on that? What does the passage mean, right? And of course, I have to assume that all of you have read the first letter of Peter somewhere in your past, right? Hopefully you are reading your Bible, regularly, maybe from the beginning to the end. And if you struggle at Leviticus, jump over it and carry on, right? But what do you currently think the passage means? If you've read the letter of 1 Peter, which I assume you have, what do you think it means? Why do you think it's there, the passage about the spirits in prison? What's its relevance to you and to me? And I think this is a good example, as we try to unravel it, of the importance of getting the context right in anything we study, right? It's terribly easy for any preacher, myself included, to just jump into a verse, take the verse and then preach what the verse means, right? That's nearly always going to get us into trouble because the Bible isn't written in single verses. I mean, Book of Proverbs might be an exception. We get little pithy sayings, right? But typically, like here, this is in the middle of chapter 3. We have chapters 1 and 2, we get 3 in chapter 4 and chapter 5. So typically, there's quite a lot of stuff around. And if you're going to look at a verse, you need to look at the verses leading up to it, the verses which come perhaps after it, try and get the context. And sometimes the context, you have to go wider and wider and wider. And I think what we'll see here is that you need the entire book or the entire letter of 1 Peter to help us to understand this mysterious passage about the spirits in prison. So a bit of brief background about the letter of 1 Peter, which we'll zoom through very rapidly, is it was written probably around 63, 64, 65, 66 AD, right? Not long before Peter was martyred. And at this particular time, when you're looking at 63, 64, 65 AD, the churches of God across the Roman Empire were facing up to some major persecution. I mean, severe persecution. It was in the days of Emperor Nero. It was a bit of a bad piece of work, right? And he got certain reasons why he wanted to attack those who had the name Christ, the Christians, right? So there was massive persecution in Rome, but actually apparently spreading across much of the Roman Empire. Major persecution. The histories give you lots of details, can't always vouchsafe for it being entirely accurate, but for example, there are stories that back in these days when Peter wrote, and that's why it's relevant, that many Christians who had the name Christ, Christ followers, right, disciples of Christ, were crucified themselves. Many Christians of that day in the Roman Empire, particularly in Rome, They used to sort of grab them, wrap animal skins around them, and then set packs of dogs on them to tear them apart. Obviously, the dogs being fooled by the animal skins into thinking it was some sort of animal they were attacking. Again, very commonly, the saints were covered in garments soaked in pitch and tar, and put on poles, and they set a light to them. So they burned as torches in the evening around Rome. Obviously, lots of screaming going on. So it was a very difficult time to be a Christian. And there were quite a few Christians suffering this persecution or fearing the persecution. So, Peter, one reason for Peter writing was to try and encourage the saints in this time of terrible persecution, which means reminding them of their great hope, right? And their great hope as a Christian, especially one facing persecution and death, was the resurrection, the future resurrection, but also a resurrection, not just a resurrection, but a resurrection to great glory. Now, if you're facing persecution and perhaps imminent death, the idea of being resurrected to glory, should help. Now, to you and me, we're probably not quite as close to problems as they were back in those days. I mean, it might come, right? At the moment, not many of us suffer any real persecution. You might have a few uncomfortable moments here and there, but none of us, I don't think, at least in the US or Western Europe, the UK, are actually facing genuine, severe persecution the way these guys and gals were, right? But the idea of a resurrection to fantastic glory, that's something that could help you keep your courage up, right? So we're going to follow the theme of persecution, being ready for it, and looking beyond to future glory. We'll see how that comes out chapter after chapter. So we're going to romp at amazing speed through 1 Peter. So let's start in chapter 1, verses 3 to 5. So if nothing else we get today, we get a brief outline of the first letter of Peter, the context. Then when you do read it yourself at any point, you'll think, I know roughly what the outline of 1 Peter is. And that will help fill in the gaps as you go. Verses 3 to 5. Blessed be the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, who according to his abundant mercy has begotten us again to a living hope through the resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead, and of course we will follow, to an inheritance incorruptible and undefiled, and that does not fade away, reserved in heaven for you who are kept by the power of God through faith for salvation, ready to be revealed in the last time. So here straight away, Peter says there is a great hope. There is an inheritance, incorruptible, undefiled, that cannot fade away, and it's reserved in heaven for you. So this is a great, fantastic inheritance that you and I have got. But moving on, verses 6 and 7. In this you greatly rejoice, the future inheritance, though now, for a little while, if need be, you have been grieved by various trials, that the genuineness of your faith, being much more precious than gold that perishes or is tested by fire, may be found to praise, honor, and glory at the revelation of Jesus Christ. So there, Peter refers briefly in this opening chapter to being grieved, troubled by various trials. And yet these trials, it says, will bring to you praise, honor, and glory at Jesus revealing. So there's a link you can see there to trials, grievous trials, sore and painful trials, but leading ultimately to praise, to honor, and to glory when Jesus returns. Look at verses 10 and 11. Of this salvation the prophets have inquired and searched carefully, who prophesied of the grace that would come to you, searching what manner of time the Spirit of Christ which was in them was indicated when he testified beforehand the sufferings of Christ and the glories that would follow. Right? So we're going to see this theme again and again, the sufferings and the ultimate glory. And also we're going to see what it mentions there. Jesus Christ suffered, but then was resurrected to glory. So sufferings are terrible while you go through them, grievous, but the back of our mind, back of their mind in Peter's day, was the prospect, the hope of resurrection and glory. And Jesus has already done that, right? Look at verse 13. Therefore, because of all this, gird up the loins of your mind, be sober, and rest your hope fully upon the grace that is to be brought to you at the revelation of Jesus Christ. You need to get your mind around this. That's what he's saying. Gird up the loins of your mind. Be prepared. Be ready. There's suffering, but future glory. Jesus suffered and is now in glory. So prepare your minds. Gird up the loins of your mind. Be ready for this, right? Verses 19 to 21. So 19, so we've been talking a few verses earlier about Jesus being the precious lamb of God, the Passover lamb. Verse 19, but with the precious blood of Christ, as of a lamb without blemish and without spot, very innocent, he indeed was foreordained before the foundation of the world, but was manifest in these last times for you, who through him believe in God, who raised Jesus from the dead and gave him glory, so that your faith and hope are in God. So again, he's just bringing out that, Jesus was humbled, sacrificed, died, which is, right, sad, and that was a lot of suffering involved there. But what? Jesus is resurrected and given glory, and that's where our faith and hope should be. So Jesus suffered, now in glory. And you and I, if persecution arises the way it did back in those days, might need to gird up our minds to get ready for severe persecution, but it leads to resurrection and glory. Look at chapter 2, verses 20 to start with. 1 Peter 2 and verse 20. For what credit is it if, when you are beaten for your faults, you take it patiently? Well, there's no credit there, right? You deserve it. But when you do good and suffer, if you take it patiently, this is commendable before God. So again, suffering's involved here, right? And your suffering is commendable if you're suffering because you're living right, because you're doing good, because you're a faithful follower of God the Father and Jesus Christ. If for doing good, for living right, you suffer, it says that's commendable, right? But not if you suffer from being a jerk. That's just, right? You deserve that. And then, to illustrate that, Peter then selects Jesus Christ as the perfect example. So verses 21 through 24, for to this you were called. So he's talking about, suffering for doing good. For to this you were called, because Christ also suffered for us, leaving us an example that you should follow his steps, which is what, of course, a Christian is, who committed no sin, nor was deceit found in his mouth, who, when he was reviled, slandered and defamed, did not revile in return. When he suffered, he did not threaten, but committed himself to him who judges righteously, who himself bore our sins in his own body on the tree, that we, having died to sins, might live for righteousness, by whose stripes you were healed. So Peter makes it very plain there. Jesus Christ is the example. Jesus suffered. Jesus was defamed. Jesus was denied justice. Jesus lived a righteous life, was a good person, right? And he suffered. And he's saying that's the example. Jesus has set you that example. He suffered. You can expect to suffer, right? But Jesus, of course, has ended up resurrected and in glory. And of course, that's the similar trajectory that you and I are following. And of course, Jesus, it says, they have suffered for our benefit, right? Chapter 4, we'll skip over chapter 3, we'll be coming back a bit later. Chapter 4, we continue the same theme of suffering, but leading to ultimate glory. So chapter 4, let's read verses 3 and 4. For we, brethren, have spent enough of our past lifetime in doing the will of the Gentiles, or the nations, the people around us, when we walked in lewdness, lusts, drunkenness, revelries, drinking parties, and abominable idolatries. In regard to these, they, your neighbors, perhaps your family, the Gentiles, etc., in regard to these, they think it strange that you do not run with them in the same flood of dissipation, speaking evil of you. Well, again, that's something you may suffer. They speak evil of you. They reviled Jesus Christ. Remember, they said Jesus did his miracles by the spirit of the devil, right? And they accused Jesus of being a blasphemer. So it says here that if you don't continue the lifestyle of those around you, they will speak evil of you. You will suffer defamation, slander, reviling, mocking, right? So get ready for it. It's going to happen. Look at verses 12 to 16. Same chapter, chapter 4, verses 12 through 16. Beloved, do not think it strange concerning the fiery trial which is to try you. Not sure I like the sound of a fiery trial. Trial's bad enough, but fiery trial, of course, like I said, back in those days, you're wrapped in garments covered in tar and pitch. They set fire to you on poles. You were like torches burning in the gardens or the highways of a night time. That would be a fiery trial, all right. Beloved, do not think it strange. Don't say, why is this happening? This is so incredibly unusual. No, do not think it strange concerning the fiery trial which is to try you, as though some strange thing happened to you. But rejoice to the extent that you partake of Christ's sufferings. You sort of share, similar experience, that when his glory is revealed, you may also be glad with exceeding joy. If you are reproached for the name of Christ, blessed are you, for the Spirit of glory and of God rests upon you. On their part, he is blasphemed, but on your part, he is glorified. But let none of you suffer as a murderer, a thief, an evildoer, or as a busybody in other people's matters. Yet, if anyone suffers as a Christian, let him not be ashamed, but let him glorify God in this matter. Right? So he's saying, get ready for persecution. Don't think it's strange. It's actually rather common, right? But never suffer abuse or slander or defamation because you are up to no good, right? There's no commendation there. If you're going to suffer, you need to suffer the way that Jesus did, by being a doer of good and suffering because of that. Chapter or verse 19 here, just to finish off. Therefore, let those who suffer according to the will of God commit their souls to him in doing good, as to a faithful Creator. Right? So get ready for persecution, but it should be and must be because you're doing good, not because you're a moron, causing trouble wherever you go because you're a fool. There's no commendation there. Whatever you get, you deserve. Right? But if you're suffering from doing good, well, you'll get resurrected. Oh, that's part of the future, resurrection and glory and, of course, triumph. Chapter 5, which is the last chapter of 1 Peter, quite a short book. So chapter 5, verse 1, the elders who are among you I exhort, I who am a fellow elder and a witness of the sufferings of Christ, and also a partaker of the glory that will be revealed. So Peter can look back and remember the days of Jesus because he walked with Jesus, right? And Peter says, I witnessed the sufferings of Jesus Christ, and he did. He was there over the years as Jesus got, pushed back and opposed and reviled and so on. He was with Jesus at Jesus' crucifixion. A slight blip in the story there, of course, but he ended up, at Jesus' crucifixion. Saw Jesus suffering and die. But he says here, he witnessed that. In a sense, he experienced it, with Jesus. But now he's looking forward to sharing the glory that will be revealed, because what we have to get so clear here is suffering precedes. If we have to suffer, not everybody does, not in this particular way, but we don't know what lies ahead a few years from now, do we? But what we can say is that suffering of this type precedes resurrection to glory and also to triumph, which will come in a bit later, right? So be prepared. Verses 8 to 11, same chapter. Verse 8, Peter's admonition to the brethren, be sober. Be vigilant, meaning be watchful, be on your guard. Because your adversary, the devil, walks about like a roaring lion, seeking whom he may devour. Resist him, steadfast in the faith, knowing that the same sufferings are experienced by your brotherhood in the world. Because although Nero was based in Rome, it does appear, according to some historians at least, that the persecution against Christians was across the Roman Empire and various countries. So that appears to be backed up by Peter, who says, the same sufferings that you're going through, being persecuted, not as individuals necessarily, but as believers generally, that's being experienced by your brotherhood in the world. But may the God of all grace, who called us to his eternal glory, that's the future, by Christ Jesus, after you have suffered a while, perfect, establish, strengthen, and settle you. To him be the glory and the dominion forever and ever. Amen. So hopefully, that's quite a brief romp through the letter of Peter, okay? But you've got hopefully the theme. The theme is be prepared for suffering as a Christian and recognize Jesus Christ, who's gone ahead of us and suffered, but is now raised to glory and triumph, right? That's sort of the theme that comes through in Peter. And we read also several times there, make sure that when you do suffer persecution, if you suffer persecution, if that's your lot in life, that you're being persecuted for doing good, for being a believer, for living a righteous life, not because you're idle, a busybody, you're some sort of fool that alienates people all around you, and what you're getting is really what you deserve, right? There's no commendation for that. And Peter's used, we can see there, Jesus as an example, as an illustration, because Jesus suffered persecution, ultimately dying, shedding his blood on the cross, but now Jesus is raised to glory in a resurrected body, and he's triumphant. And Peter's comments here and there, we read some of them, is look to Jesus from that perspective. See Jesus as your example of suffering, but also bear in mind Jesus as your example of resurrection to glory and triumph. Both parts, right? We can see that mentioned elsewhere. If you hold your place in 1 Peter, but let's turn to Hebrews chapter 12. So Hebrews chapter 12. And verses 1 through 3, just bringing out that other writers point us to Jesus as our example, as Peter has done there. Jesus is your example of suffering, but ultimate resurrection and glory. So here, chapter 12, verses 1 through 3. Therefore we also, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, that's chapter 11, the hearers of faith, let us lay aside every weight and the sin which so easily ensnares us, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us, looking unto Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith. Jesus begins our faith, Jesus completes our faith. But notice he's saying there, let us look to Jesus, right? Who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and has sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. So Jesus, he suffered, a great deal. He endured the cross, right? It says so there, which was humiliating and a great suffering there. But Jesus did that it says, for the joy that was set before him. So Jesus knew beyond the suffering there was resurrection, glory, and triumph. And that apparently helped Jesus to endure. Verse 3, for consider him, that's the instruction to you and to me, consider Jesus, who endured such hostility from sinners against himself, lest you become weary and discouraged in your souls. Have you ever felt weary and discouraged? Well, yeah, probably most of us many times from a whole bunch of stuff. I mean, life can be quite tricky, right? There can be all manner of disappointments in decisions we make, choices we make, friends we thought we had, and so on and so forth, right? But we're talking here about following Jesus. It says, consider Jesus who endured such hostility, meaning reflect, contemplate the life of Jesus. When you're feeling a bit like it's too much, all the hassle I'm getting, consider Jesus. Contemplate the life of Jesus Christ. Focus on the life of Jesus Christ, who had to put up with a whole bunch of hostility from sinners, right? Pharisees, Sadducees, Judas, plenty of others, right? So Jesus suffered enormously, but he did it with one eye on the joy that was set before him, allowing him to endure the cross and everything that led up to it, because he saw the glory, the resurrection. And you and I, it says there, we can consider Jesus. So don't just think of your pathetic little self, right? And the problems that you've got, which are probably minimal compared to Jesus. So think of what Jesus had to go through, right? That's the illustration there. 1 Peter, so let's go back there, chapter 4 and verse 1. Therefore, since Christ suffered for us in the flesh, arm yourselves also with the same mind, for he who has suffered in the flesh has ceased from sin. So the point Peter's making there, and it's close to the passage we're studying, since Christ suffered for us in the flesh, as a fleshly human being as he was, arm yourselves with the same mind. Jesus suffered. Consider Jesus. Look unto Jesus. Jesus is your example. Jesus suffered in the flesh. Arm yourselves with the same mind. Other translations, arm yourselves with the same resolve. Jesus resolved to stick with it, even to the death on the cross. Arm yourselves with the same determination. So Jesus suffered. Do we have the same determination? Arm yourselves with the same purpose. Jesus suffered for us in the flesh. Do we have the same determination, the same resolve, the same sense of purpose, that we can suffer in the flesh if necessary, if that's the will of God for us to suffer persecution, severe persecution like they did in this particular time that Peter's writing, right? Now most of us today don't suffer, not real persecution, but a few uncomfortable moments. If you're keeping the Sabbath, I've had a few of those in the past. If you want to leave early on the Friday, you can be mocked and scoffed at, but it's not persecution, is it? It's just a little bit of minor trouble. But looking through the letter of Peter here, the theme, I think, is fairly clear. Expect persecution, right? Have your mind ready for persecution if it comes. If and when it comes, look to Jesus, because he's the example. He suffered persecution. He died, but is now, of course, risen to glory. So the theme of 1 Peter is, I think, relatively sort of clear, right? The theme of, if you're going to suffer persecution, suffer it for doing good, not for, being a bit silly, right? But then the question is, so why on earth talk about spirits in prison? What's that got to do with anything at all? It just appears to be a completely peculiar passage, just floating there aimlessly. What's it for? What's it talking about? Why is it relevant to suffering persecution, right? So let's look at that passage a little bit more closely then. So first of all, who are the spirits in prison? Right? We said earlier that lots of churches think it's Old Testament, people who died long ago, or people in purgatory having the gospel preached to them and so on. Well, there are no scriptures in the New Testament which ever use the term spirit for a human being, right? Spirit does not refer to a human being. The term spirit appears a number of times in the New Testament, quite a common word actually, but it's typically, or not typically, it's nearly always talking of supernatural beings. So spirits are supernatural beings. It can be angels, because we won't turn there, but in Hebrews chapter 1, for example, verses 7 and 14, it refers to the angels are spirits. The angels are ministering spirits sent forth to those who are heirs of salvation. So angels are referred to in the New Testament as spirits. No great surprise there. The other individuals who are spirits, of course, are the demons, right? We read, Jesus talks in a number of places about unclean spirits, right? Deaf and dumb spirit. When Paul was preaching Philippi, I think, he came across a young girl who was possessed with a spirit of divination, spirit of Python, curiously, in the Greek. So spirits are supernatural beings. You occasionally find spirit and human beings sort of linked, but it's always clear from the context it's a human being. For example, it talks about the spirits of just men in the book of Hebrews, spirits of just men. It talks about the spirit in man in 1 Corinthians chapter 2, I think it is. But you're talking of spirits in isolation. Angels are spirits, and the demons are spirits. So spirits are supernatural beings. So these spirits in prison are supernatural beings, not people, because we know when people die, right? People, when they die, are dead. They're not conscious, right? They're not anywhere. And Peter himself talks about spirits in prison himself. I'm going to go too far. Let's just turn to 2 Peter, just a couple of 3 chapters later on. 2 Peter, we'll find Peter himself, who talks about spirits in prison, telling us about spirits in prison. Only makes it much more clear. So 2 Peter chapter 2, verses 4 and 5. For if God did not spare the angels who sinned, but cast them down to hell, margin Tartarus, and delivered them into chains of darkness to be reserved for judgment. So here's sinning angels who have been cast down to Tartarus or hell and are in chains of darkness, right? To be reserved for judgment, and verse 5, did not spare the ancient world, but saved Noah, one of 8 people, a preacher of righteousness, bringing in the flood on the world of the ungodly. That might become relevant in a moment or two, right? So here we have the angels who sinned, sinning angels. And angels are, of course, spirits, right? As Hebrews 1 makes it plain. And these sinning angels have been cast down and are enchained. I think one translation says they're chained in gloomy dungeons, right? But the margin says the Greek is Tartarus. So these sinning angels have been imprisoned in a place called Tartarus. I don't know why so many Bibles translate it as the word hell, because that just confuses absolutely everybody. Hell could be Hades, hell could be Gehenna, and this once it appears as Tartarus. Tartarus is not really a particularly useful word to translate as hell, doesn't mean a lot. Tartarus is Peter borrowing from Greek mythology, sort of, right? In Greek mythology, there's a place called Tartarus. In Greek mythology, there's a place called Tartarus where the gods, the Greek gods, imprison, strangely enough, their enemies. So those that really offend the gods, typically other spirit beings, are thrust way down under the earth, in fact underneath Hades, into Tartarus, and they're locked up and imprisoned in Tartarus. And that appears to be the picture that the Apostle Peter is using to talk about the sinning angels and where they are. We have, I think, an artist's illustration of Tartarus. I mean, nobody's been there. Because at the end of the day, it's sort of a Greek mythological term, so that's an artist's illustration. Fires, darkness, smoke in this place called Tartarus in Greek mythology. Only extra point I'd make there is that rather than Peter necessarily stealing the idea of Tartarus from the Greeks, it's quite likely, in my opinion, that the Greeks borrowed the idea of Tartarus from the facts, that it was general knowledge in the ancient world that certain sinning angels were cast down into some deep dungeon. And I imagine the Greeks took that knowledge, which is true, and then they embellished it and created, their something fictional version of it. So when Peter borrows Tartarus, he's probably actually borrowing something that itself was borrowed from the actual facts of the sinning angels being cast into some dungeon somewhere. And you notice, by the way, in verse 5, a reference there to Noah again, right? Saved Noah, one of 8 people, a preacher of righteousness, bringing in the flood on the world of that day. So the spirits in prison are sinning angels who've been cast down and chained up, and it seems to be in reference to the days of Noah, because they're linked together by and. So he cast the angels down and didn't spare the ancient world of Noah and the flood, right? Now back in 1 Peter 3:20, it won't be returned there just for the moment, we'll be getting there shortly. It does mention that that Jesus preached to the spirits in prison who once were disobedient in the days of Noah, when the ark was preparing, in which 8 souls were saved. So that's 2 places where the disobedient sinning angels are identified as the timeline of Noah's flood. Okay, let's look at Jude. And let's read verses 5 and 6. There's only one chapter in Jude. Jude's the book before Revelation. So sinning angels cast down into Tartarus in chains. That's what Peter said, right? Spirits in prison, which Peter said in his previous letter. Verses 5 and 6. But I want to remind you, says Jude, though you once knew this, that the Lord, having saved the people out of the land of Egypt, afterward destroyed those who did not believe. And we know that. All the adults, apart from Joshua and Caleb, died in the wilderness. Verse 6, and the angels who did not keep their proper domain, but left their own abode, he has reserved in everlasting chains under darkness for the judgment of the great day. So here's Jude now writing about these angels who clearly sinned, were disobedient, didn't remain in their proper abode. It says, right, they left their abode, they didn't stay there, and those angels who were disobedient and sinned are reserved in everlasting chains under darkness. Clearly the same relevance, same reference to what we just read in 2 Peter 2. And what seems to be the case, I don't want to get too much into speculation, is that back in the days of Noah, in the centuries leading up to Noah's Ark being built, the angels of that time had helped to completely corrupt mankind. If you remember, the book of Genesis tells us that the earth was filled with violence in those days, and every imagination of man's heart was only evil continually, and it repented the Lord that he had made man on the earth. It was so bad, right? So the world was utterly corrupt, utterly evil, utterly violent. God was desperately sorry he'd even started his plan. It was that bad. It was beyond correction. There's no way you could have corrected the world of that day. So God decided to basically wipe it out. He terminated creation 1.0, right? Couldn't go any further. And after that, after the flood, God's plan changed quite significantly. Rather than trying to work with the world as before the flood, God chose one man, Abraham, and one man's family, and one man's seed, right? That's where we are today. Very different plan from the first one. And it looks like the sinning angels who sinned there in the days of Noah, the days of the preparing of the ark, they contributed by their wickedness to the destruction of the whole world in the days of Noah and the flood, because it says that the angels were disobedient. They were sinning angels in the days of Noah, right? We've got, I think, one more picture to put up, fairly obvious looking picture, nothing particularly remarkable there. That's the flood. There's the ark in the background there, and there's people's bodies. But I mean, when the flood was finished, everything in which the breath of air was dead. So God's great plan to extend his family, and there could have been, some people reckon, up to 1 billion people on the earth in the days of Noah, due to big families multiplying and people living hundreds of years apiece. That came to a destructive end because God just wiped it out, destroyed it. And it does seem that many of the sinning angels thought they'd won somehow, right? But Jesus, of course, came, thankfully, as Redeemer, to redeem us from death and destruction, to ensure that God's plan ultimately would be successful, that God's family ultimately would grow and multiply with sons and daughters who would live forever. So after a humiliating death, naked on a cross, doesn't get much worse than that, Jesus was raised to glory, raised to his resurrection body, immortal, right? Raised to glory, to power, and raised in victory over everything, right? Every knee will bow to Jesus Christ, every knee. Things above, on the earth, below the earth, everything has to bow to Jesus Christ, because once Jesus Christ was resurrected to glory, right, he was triumphant. And in that triumph, he went to the spirits in prison and proclaimed to them his glorious triumph, his victory and God's victory. Because don't forget, these are the spirits who were disobedient back in the days of Noah. These were the sinning angels who were disobedient back in the days of Noah. They appear, from what I can make out, to have played a big part in the corruption of mankind and the destruction of the flood. So they probably thought they'd won, right? Jesus goes to them and proclaims, right? Proclaims victory and triumph to the sinning angels, the spirits in prison. I would imagine he may not have used the word, but I think he got there who said, "Hey, losers, right? You lost. The plan's moving forward. The family is growing. You guys are ultimate losers," right? And that's why it's better to suffer for doing good than for doing evil, because the outcome is so much better. If we follow the example of Jesus Christ, who suffered for doing good but is now glorified and triumphant, you and I do the same. We can suffer with the ultimate outcome of resurrection to glory and to triumph. Now, Jesus went into the spirits in prison. He talked about his triumph. Let's go back to that passage then. 1 Peter chapter 3. We'll pick up in verse 17. For it is better, says Peter, if it is the will of God, and it depends the days we live in and so on. I mean, at the moment, not many of us are suffering, serious persecution as groups of people, right? You might be an occasional person here or there, and I guess if you become a Christian somewhere like Iran, some parts of China, you might well be persecuted, big time. But most of us in the Western world don't see much of this. But verse 17, for it is better, if it is the will of God, to suffer for doing good than for doing evil, for or because, right? And then Peter brings in this illustration about the spirits in prison to illustrate why it's better to suffer for doing good, that they're linked together, that they're integral, right? Because, verse 18, Christ also suffered once for sins, the just for the unjust. Not fair that Jesus, who was a just and righteous man, suffered. Not fair at all. It won't be fair if you or I suffer persecution for doing good. It's not fair, right? But we're not to retaliate. The just for the unjust, that he might bring us to God, being put to death in the flesh, or according to the flesh, but made alive by or according to the Spirit. Jesus died in the flesh, body was dead, but then made alive in the Spirit, by which also he went and preached to the spirits in prison. Now, the word preach there is not the word typically used for preaching the gospel. The word for preaching the gospel is evangelize in the Greek, right? And it's not that. The word preached here, and some translations might have it differently, is to proclaim as a herald. So Jesus didn't go and preach. He's not preaching sin and salvation and repentance to those in spirits in prison, the sinning angels, right? They've had their chance long ago. He's proclaiming. It's a public proclamation of their utter failure and Jesus and his Father's utter complete victory over everything. Everything has been defeated, right? By which also he went and proclaimed as a herald to the spirits in prison who formerly were disobedient, when once the divine long-suffering waited in the days of Noah, while the ark was being prepared, in which a few, that is 8 souls, were saved through water. They were disobedient in the days of Noah leading up to the flood. That's when the sinning angels were disobedient. Not talking about, pre-Genesis 1 or anything. This is something that happened in the days leading up to the flood. Say so. It's plain as the nose in my face, right? Verse 22, talking of Jesus still, who has now gone into heaven and is at the right hand of God. Angels and authorities and powers having been made subject to him. All right? Jesus is alive, resurrected, at the right hand of God in heaven, over all authorities, all angels, all powers. Jesus is the top. He is supreme. Every knee must bow to Jesus Christ, right? And of course, you and I get to follow. Jesus suffered, resurrected to glory and fantastic triumph. Those who follow Jesus may have to suffer if it's God's will for that particular period they live in, but at the end of it, there is resurrection to glory and great triumph to sit with Jesus Christ in his throne, right? So that's why it's illustration is pointing out the fantastic victory and triumph of Jesus Christ, who suffered but ended up in glory. And the point of Peter's letter is, you may suffer, but you have ultimate glory, as Jesus exemplified when he went to the spirits in prison and told them, hey guys, you're losers, right? My Father and I, we've won, right? 1 Peter 4, let's just finish off with verse 6, I think it is, which I didn't misquote it, sorry. I mean, I took it out of context earlier, deliberately, because I was just saying that, the Catholics, at least some Catholics, I can't say all of them, use the spirits in prison as some sort of vague reference to purgatory. They have to struggle a bit to find any reference to purgatory. I mean, there is none, of course, because it doesn't exist, other than, I think, in might be the books of the Maccabees, the Apocrypha, right? So, spirits in prison, that's souls of sinners being purified as they await the invitation to go up to heaven and meet God and gaze at the beatific vision, right? So Catholics, some Catholics at least, use the spirits in prison as an illustration of purgatory, which is complete nonsense. And then they quite like verse 6 here of chapter 4. For this reason the gospel was preached to those who are dead. Well, I was trying to mislead you there. It's talking about those who are now dead. But the gospel was preached, and that is preaching the gospel. That's a different word, right? That is the word to evangelize. For this reason the gospel was preached or evangelized also to those who are now dead. But of course they heard the gospel when they were alive, before they ran out of time, right? For this reason the gospel, the good news, was preached to those who are now dead, that they might be judged according to men in the flesh, but live according to God in the Spirit. All right? So these saints are now dead, but they will be resurrected to glory and in triumph, especially if they suffered, right? As Jesus suffered, as many saints were suffering at this time. Okay, so that's more or less it. So I guess there's 3 takeaways, or at least 3 I can think of. Number 1 is, hopefully we've now understand at least the outline theme of Peter's first letter to the brethren, right? Be prepared, arm your souls, be ready for suffering, especially the suffering of persecution, right? happened to Jesus, happened to many saints. If it's God's will, it may happen to you too. So number one theme, expect and be ready for persecution and suffering, right? But of course realize that ultimate glory and triumph. Second thing is, hopefully we now understand who the spirits in prison are. It's sinning angels who sinned back in the days of Noah. There are views as to what those sins were, but that's a rabbit hole I'm not proposing to go down at the moment. But right, also they did something back in the days of Noah that brought an end to creation 1.0, right? So that's who the spirits in prison are, sinning angels. And number three, I guess, takeaway is that just as you and I may suffer sufferings like Jesus did, you and I get to enjoy the resurrection, the glory, and the triumph that Jesus currently enjoys, right? So that's a good outcome. Okay, with that, hopefully, we've concluded our study of that mysterious passage in 1 Peter chapter 3. Okay, done for now.